Hello.
Can you hear me now?
Excellent.
Excellent. Ho!
Hello, Dwight. Hello, Chris.
Hello, Aaron.
Thank you guys for joining us this afternoon.
Anytime I can join with Chris on doing something, it's a good day.
Good. So, I'm going to see if I can make you
There we go.
a co-host, Christopher.
Okay. Good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
All right. Step one.
It looks like you're in the middle of the Amador Hotel.
You know, it's amazing. They let anyone into this place. I had to go back in time about 120 years, though.
You should be in black and white.
You know, it was black and white back in the past. From what I understand, every picture will confirm that.
Yeah, that's true. That's
Yeah,
true.
I'm doing some time travel. I think this is better than the actual backdrop. I don't have a bookcase.
Ah,
I might be in my laundry room.
now Aaron's got a bookcase.
Yeah,
That's
that's a bookcase.
proper.
Serious
That's
bookcase.
proper.
Yeah, that's Dr. Minge's collection behind me.
Ah,
That's awesome. Those are real books.
Yeah, very old books, too. We have
Mhm.
a few from the early 1800s in there.
Wow.
wow.
So I've made you the co-host, so I think you'll be able to share your screen to show the PowerPoint.
Okay. Now I also have this clip from the film, the trailer for Canes of Power. Do you want to play that on your end, or do you want me to? I mean, what do you think we should do on that?
Yeah, that's fine. I have it pulled up.
Okay.
So I can definitely do that. I just have to share my screen and then play the video.
I think that should work. I mean, in terms of audio and it actually working.
Perfect. Yeah,
So,
I can try right now. Why don't I do that?
Let me find out. And I need to. Okay, here we are.
Okay. So you can see everything on my screen. How's the audio there? Perfect. Okay. Great.
I couldn't hear the audio. Could you guys hear it come in?
Let's see.
That's the
Might
thing
have
I'm
to-
concerned about is the buffering on that, if it's gonna work.
I might have to do it without headphones. That might be the problem. Let's see if this works. It's pretty low still.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can't hear anything.
Okay.
Holly, I have a question for you. So I wonder if you have to make sure everyone's muted. And
Oh, want to try that?
Share it. Yeah, sorry, I don't know. Well, I have provided the link for everyone.
hey, Holly. Nope. Well, darn it.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that.
Just 1 second.
Aaron, how many subscribers do you think you'll get today?
Probably around 50. We typically get around 50 people for this, but we've been advertising this for over 3 months, so we might get even more.
And you're going to coordinate any questions we might get.
I will. I'll ask everybody to keep themselves on mute and then type questions, and we'll answer them towards the end.
Okay, so no on the film probably, huh?
Yeah, unfortunately,
Okay.
I was able to provide the link to the film.
Yeah.
So people will be able to see it on their own.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll be able to say about what I know, which probably sufficient, but we'll see how that goes. Okay. Doc, did you want me to put up any maps or anything while you're talking, or I have some maps of New Mexico that you might see. And
do you have a map maybe of the whole Southwest?
yeah, I do actually.
That as I said, I don't have a PowerPoint, and I didn't think of putting up. Actually, I don't know how to do it. I'm old school. But if you've got a map of the Southwest, that might help. Once, particularly in the early part of my remarks.
So let me see here. So I have that one.
Yeah, that might work. That would be good.
So obviously that's showing New Mexico at the beginning of Lincoln's presidency.
Right.
And now the funner, the more funner
works, yeah.
Is this one, which is you can see the Confederates' territory of Arizona, and how this was briefly envisioned, the New Mexico-Arizona borders. Never recognized, but anyway. And of course there's this one, but
yeah, that's too late. That's the other one. The first one I think will work.
Yeah,
just fine.
That's official, and still Arizona is there. You can see Arizona is that the Gadsden Purchase area.
Yeah,
really, kind of what that is. But
yep.
All right, cool.
That's where I live. That's where we live.
Hey, I wonder why I look familiar. Yeah, and Gadsden Purchase. Okay. I can share that. You don't want this up the whole time, but if you'd like, we just say, "Oh, pull up that map," and
okay.
I think I should be able to do that.
Okay.
All right. So let me get out of there. Okay. Cool. So Aaron, how is the museum up there? You guys, have you been open at all, physically open, or how have you been impacted by this?
Yeah, we've been, it's been on and off. We've had to close twice last year, but we closed for December and January annually because there's no environmental control in the museum. We don't have heating. So we opened in February, and we've had a few tours already. the numbers are going down, and
Mhm.
Sandoval County is officially yellow, so we're hoping
Mhm.
this will help us.
Mhm.
Aaron, where are you located exactly?
We're in Corrales, in
Right.
the heart of Corrales.
Where in Corrales?
Right in the middle, right smack dab in the middle.
On the main road?
Yeah, it's right off the main road. It's called Old Church Road.
Oh, yeah. Mhm.
We're right next to the old church out there.
Okay.
Doc, what have you been doing? Are you not at NMSU's been kind of a crazy
Yeah.
place to be. Or
Yeah,
not
I'm
be.
sort of winnowing my way away from the university. I haven't taught in probably 18 months or
Right.
so, but got out 2 manuscripts. One on Tennessee's secession documents, which is very much in press. I sent back final comments, and we'll expect the page proofs maybe next week. And this is University of Tennessee Press. And they're also looking at a manuscript I did on Kentucky's secession documents. And that manuscript is done. And then they're also reviewing a proposal to do a similar book on Virginia. So I've been busy with my thing,
Mhm.
researching and writing and staying out of my wife's way.
Well, that's difficult to do, though. But sometimes, anyway.
Our house is large enough that she has her nest and I have my nest.
Oh, good.
So
Oh, good.
works well. We meet in the middle,
Okay. And in the kitchen.
in the kitchen. That's right.
Why Tennessee? Is there a reason why you went from New Mexico to Tennessee? And are you going to do the same thing you did on your New Mexico book?
Well,
Tennessee?
both Tennessee and Kentucky had a lot of documents, just a really rich collection of documents from secession winter that lent themselves to a book. And Virginia has more than enough. I had to winnow out things, just tons and tons of stuff. The Virginia Secession Convention produced 4 volumes and 3,000 pages of published stuff. So there's much there. Tennessee is an interesting state because it was the last to secede.
Mhm.
And it had sort of a strange path to secession. It never called a secession convention. It decided that the General Assembly should do it. So in spite of the people voting, white men in the state voting against secession in February, after secession, the governor and the legislature colluded and essentially joined the Confederacy. Although to cover themselves, they put it to a vote to the people, but that was 3 weeks after they had already joined the Confederacy. So it's an interesting story about sort of a twisted road to secession.
I had thought Kentucky was a border state, but
It is.
not.
Yeah.
It was.
Yeah, and Kentucky is one of those states that didn't secede, which makes it an interesting state to look at.
There's half of it. It's kind of almost not as bad as Missouri, but it's sort of like in that half of it was slave friendly, at least.
Well, indeed. And in fact, once the state government decided not to secede, a bunch of citizens got together and considered themselves part of the Confederacy. So there's sort of a rump Confederate government that never existed in Kentucky. It had to go into Tennessee to exist. Same with Missouri.
Yeah.
Missouri decided not to secede, formally decided not to secede. They voted in their secession convention, but a rump government of some legislators and some other people decided to form a rump government. So, and they're very much, there's a book out, something like When Kentucky Went Confederate After the War, because they stayed in because they thought slavery was safe. By the end of the war, slavery wasn't safe. And so they embraced the Confederacy sort of after the fact. So it makes it's a good story in Kentucky as well.
The movie, did you see Lincoln, the recent movie Lincoln? So it was just on TV yesterday.
Oh, you're kidding.
And so of course I watched it, and it has mostly to deal with the passage of the 13th Amendment.
Right.
Which I imagine you may discuss or maybe not, but it was really interesting how how tenuous that was. And you're reminded of that line that Lincoln was having to straddle the whole time, this entire presidency.
Yeah.
That he never had a really clear, strong majority. He was always having to accommodate, the other side or the other sides, the conservative Republicans, and really a fine line throughout his entire presidency.
Yeah.
And that 13th Amendment was just a real symbol of that, because they didn't have the votes.
Yeah.
They really didn't have the votes.
He had to do a lot of arm twisting.
Yeah, and it was just, it was just really fascinating, the whole debate, actually. What does that mean when you free the slaves? Well, that means a whole lot.
Yeah. And what does it not mean?
Yeah, right.
Does it mean equal civil rights, or just
Yeah.
freedom, or the absence of slavery?
No.
Yeah, I'm going to stick to pre-Civil War,
Sure.
but maybe in the question and answers that will come up.
Yeah. No, it's an interesting thing. I was reminded of that.
Yeah, it's a fascinating period, no question about it.
Okay. Do you need me to do anything, Aaron, in terms of
No,
share the screen? And
yeah, you're good.
All right.
As soon as 1 o'clock hits, I will admit everyone, and I'll introduce both of you, and I'll let you take it away, Chris.
Okay. I'm going to mute for a second here.
How long have you been up there, Aaron?
This is my 3rd year out here. I started in early 2018.
Out here, where were you before?
I was at Los Poblanos.
Oh, yeah,
Yeah, in Rio Grande.
right, right.
And I was managing their cultural center up there.
Oh, interesting.
Wanted to go more into historic preservation, and this kind of just fell in my lap. I found it and became a city employee just last year.
Yeah.
They didn't have a full-time position for this place,
Well, good.
which is crazy, but
Yeah.
yeah, we're making progress.
Are you from up there?
No, I'm actually originally from Idaho,
No.
but I've lived in New Mexico for most of my life now.
Chris, you're a native, as I recall.
Oh, I was an Army brat, actually. So I moved
Oh,
around every year until I was 14 or so, and moved to Las Cruces, and moved away several times, and they keep pulling me back. But yeah, I've been here for about 20, 30 years now at this point.
Yeah.
I think that's New Mexican enough.
I agree.
My dad was a Deming native, so and
Oh,
there they are right there,
Yeah.
showing up, mom and dad. Figuring out Zoom. My dad is wondering what's going on.
Hello, everyone. I'm just going to give a couple of minutes to let people join us.
Hi, everybody.
Hi, Joe.
I hope everyone is well.
I think somebody is accidentally sharing their screen.
You could probably shut it off, Aaron.
Let's see. There we go.
Hi, Mr. Kelleher.
Hi,
Nice.
Joe.
Nice hat, by the way. Miss Carla, nice to see you. Joe and Mary. Joe,
Hello.
nice to see you all. Mr. Frichette's joining us today too.
Well, I see Mr. Kelleher. Hi, Michael. Haven't seen you in a while. Yes.
All right, I think we can go ahead and get started. Thank you everyone for joining us today. We have Dr. Dwight Pitcaithley and Christopher Schurtz joining us today. They're going to tell us a little bit about Lincoln's connection to New Mexico, as well as the Civil War and secession in New Mexico. Christopher Schurtz is a New Mexico historian who focuses on the history of Las Cruces and the Mesilla Valley. He has a master's degree in history from New Mexico State University. Oh, if you could please mute yourself.
Sometimes, if you put an interface in between the two.
Please mute yourself if you can. In 2009, Schurtz worked with the Brannigan Cultural Center in Las Cruces to develop an exhibit examining Abraham Lincoln's impact on New Mexico in support of a traveling exhibit on Lincoln supported by the Smithsonian. His article, The Unique Legacy of Abraham Lincoln, was published in the 2010 edition of Southern New Mexico Historical Journal. In addition, Schurtz has served as a historical consultant and researcher for several local museums and has taught courses in U.S. history, public history, military history at the State New Mexico University and El Paso Community College. And Dr. Dwight Pitcaithley is a college professor at New Mexico State University. He retired from the National Park Service in 2005 after serving as chief historian for 10 years. During his 30-year career with the National Park Service, he served in Santa Fe, Boston, and Washington, D.C., where he focused on issues relating to historic preservation and the interpretation of historic sites. He is also the author of the United States Constitution and Secession, a documentary anthology of slavery and white supremacy. And he has a book coming out called Tennessee Seeds, a documentary history forthcoming from the University of Tennessee Press. So I will go ahead and let you take it away, Chris. Thank you both so much for coming out today.
All right. Well, let me pull up my PowerPoint. Greetings, everyone. Thank you for joining us. And this worked in the past, so let's see if it works today. There we go. Technology is our friend. except when it is not. I'm assuming everyone can see that.
We can see you. Yeah.
Okay, all right. Well, this may have to suffice. I'm trying to full screen this thing, but how about this? There we go. There he is. There's the man. The unique legacy of Abraham Lincoln in New Mexico. Let me bring to it. So, what do we know about Lincoln and what does he know about New Mexico? Well, his words on New Mexico are very few. In fact, they probably mostly have to do with the debate that was gripping the country at the time, which was obviously slavery, and more specifically, the extension of slavery into the Western territories. So he would have likely seen New Mexico in the company of other Western territories, Colorado, Utah, Nevada. And what he would have known about New Mexico probably would have been very little. He's a little preoccupied, with a certain war, but what he would have known is what others like him would have known. New Mexico, population of roughly 90,000 people. Of course, the vast majority are Native American, several different tribes, Hispanics of Mexican descent, fewer than 1,000 Anglo residents who would slowly trickle in the 1850s. New Mexico is largely a Spanish-speaking, Catholic, and foreign population to many back east. And they're also a landholding population, legally landholding, land grants. And so he would have known that as well. Now, New Mexico has a slave code passed in 1859 in New Mexico Territory, which allows the institution of slavery, the peculiar institution, although New Mexico had its own practice of slavery, enslavement of Native Americans that had gone for many generations, but of course, African slavery is quite different. So there were roughly about 20 enslaved African Americans who had resided in New Mexico at the time of Lincoln. And these were probably just servants of the officers, army officers who were stationed in New Mexico. New Mexico, very, in the minds of many back east, very desolate, very distant. Some farming, but this is long before the Reclamation Acts that enable much farming in New Mexico. So some farming, mostly ranching. Mining is looking very promising. In fact, it's through the mining, through the wealth that probably Lincoln's primary interest is in the West, but he has other interests as well. The State of the Union address in 1863, of course, this is after Arizona comes in as its own territory. He states that the immense mineral resources of some of those territories ought to be developed as quickly as possible. His interest is in extracting the mineral wealth of the West. And New Mexico is just one of these territories, Colorado, Nevada, Idaho, that are proving far richer than has heretofore been understood. So obviously his interest is in the mineral wealth of the West, and the previously mentioned debate over extending slavery into the West, which Lincoln was adamantly opposed to. So this is the map of New Mexico during at least half of Lincoln's time. We'll talk later about how Lincoln himself impacts a change on this map. And we see New Mexico is far too large. We could possibly agree on that. But this was what New Mexico would have looked like when Lincoln took office. You see in the southern part of New Mexico, Arizona. And for many years, this was the way that people saw New Mexico and Arizona as sort of split in this sort of way. Arizona is really what was called the Gadsden Purchase, which is that sliver of land that is purchased after the Mexican War is concluded, made official in 1854 for the price of $10 million, largely to accommodate a possible transcontinental railroad, which was envisioned. So again, mining, the extraction of wealth. We've got a war that we need to fund and a nation to build. So this is Lincoln's primary interest, I would submit, in the West. There's a very practical need for the mineral wealth, to extract that mineral wealth. It's one of the reasons he signs the Organic Act in February of 1863 that creates the borders of New Mexico and Arizona to essentially accommodate mining and also the railroad later on. Many of you may have seen this painting before, John Gast's painting American Progress, depicting manifest destiny, which we probably are all familiar with the idea. This idea that most of white Americans held during the 1800s, that America was destined to stretch from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And as it moved west, it was bringing the light of civilization to the darkness of the West. So we see in this one painting, rather kind of over the top, sort of romanticized idea. Lady Liberty, who could not vote or hold public office, never mind. There she is, bringing the light of the world. In her hand, she clutches the book of knowledge, education. She's dragging also a telegraph wire in her hand. And then we see the other representations of the move west. We see the miners, we see the settlers, the homesteaders, as you will, the miners, the farmers, the train, the railroad. Of course, this painting is done long after Lincoln, but this is the idea that dominates American policy. And this is what dominates Lincoln's ideas of the West and what needs to happen in the West. Of course, there were 300,000, at least 300,000 people already living in the West, at least what we called the West, Americans called the West. And that is dozens of various and distinct Native American tribes stretching from the northern border to the southern border. And some pretty important events occurred during Lincoln's presidency regarding the Indian Wars, particularly in Minnesota in 1862, with the Sioux Uprising, as it was sometimes called, an event that resulted in the deaths of dozens, if not hundreds, of white settlers and Native peoples as well. By the end of this conflict in Minnesota, 38 Dakota men will be hanged in the largest mass execution in history. Lincoln will himself pardon and roughly 300 others. Of course, they will serve time in prison for their role in that uprising. And also the Sand Creek Massacre in Colorado of 1864, largely led by Colonel John Chivington of the Colorado Volunteers, who had played a very pivotal role in the war in New Mexico, but would play a rather infamous role in this particular massacre of between 100 to 200 mostly unarmed Native peoples at Sand Creek. So both of these events occur, obviously, with full knowledge of Abraham Lincoln, with tacit agreement, really. Lincoln, as presidents before him and after, pursued and supported an aggressive policy when it came to securing the West for settlers and for America, for manifest destiny. So aggression, treaties, the reservations, the Indian Bureau, which he felt did have its problems, called the Indian system. He felt that there were problems that he would address as soon as the Civil War was concluded. Of course, he doesn't get that opportunity. Now, in New Mexico, the war, the Indian Wars, is largely waged or led, at least, by General James Carleton, who comes here during the Civil War as part of that particular force, and then remains to essentially serve as a military governor of New Mexico. And he wages a scorched earth campaign against the Apache and the Navajo, who, in some fairness, themselves were waging a pretty scorched earth campaign against Mexican American settlers in these areas. So the violence, it was a violent exchange, certainly. But Carleton takes it to new heights for sure. Perhaps most infamously in New Mexico with his campaign against the Navajo, culminating in the Long Walk, which is New Mexico's version, if you will, of the Trail of Tears. After a months-long campaign led by Kit Carson, the Navajo are forced to surrender around Fort Defiance over there in Arizona. You see this map here, and are essentially forcibly marched east to Fort Sumner and the Bosque Redondo Reservation. It's not known the specific numbers, but perhaps as many as 500 Navajo will die either en route or shortly after arriving at Bosque Redondo, which, even though it shows some initial promise, the idea of turning this into some kind of agricultural paradise quickly disappears. The water is very brackish. The ground is not suited to accommodating large numbers of people, thousands if it were, not to mention the Navajo and the Apache both were supposed to live side by side at Bosque Redondo, though they had a years-long tensions between the two, shall we say. Despite this rather aggressive campaign and policy toward the Apache and the Navajo, he takes a very different approach toward the 19 Pueblo tribes that then existed in New Mexico. And partly because the Pueblos had not been as, like we say, violent and aggressive, that is probably largely one reason, certainly. But he recognizes the neutrality and the sovereignty of the Pueblo peoples. And for many years, the Spanish, many years prior, obviously, the Spanish and then the Mexican government had made a sort of practice of giving these ceremonial canes to the Pueblo governors, the governors of these various Pueblos. And these canes specifically would vary, but in the case of Lincoln, he heard about this in tradition and felt it was be a neat thing to do. So he arranges to have canes made. They're now sometimes called the Lincoln canes, made for the 19 governors of the New Mexico's Pueblos. And each of these canes is tapped with or capped with a silver kind of cap there. And on each of them is inscribed A. Lincoln 1863. And these canes are still used in ceremonies to this day. Probably the way that Lincoln has the most direct and literal impact on New Mexico is through his appointments, through patronage. And in a way that he tries to use this, and any president before or after him would as well, to use these positions to further and perpetuate perhaps the Republican Party platform, Republican ideals, or largely the American ideals as he sees it in terms of the West. And through patronage is essentially the awarding of political offices or government offices for some other political reward or whatever. So it takes certainly many different forms. And sometimes he's very active in it. And other times he's simply taking the advice of people who know their particular territories. And that's probably the case in New Mexico. Historians don't believe that he took a very active role in New Mexico, particularly as the Civil War continues to drag on. And he makes some interesting appointments. You would think he would appoint only Republicans to these, but that's not the case. In fact, Henry Connolly is the territorial governor, and he keeps Connolly as governor. In fact, reappoints him in 1864. And Connolly, in his youth, or his family were slave holders, but he's no longer one. And he had been in New Mexico for much of his life, in fact. And largely as an effort to kind of bridge this political divide that Lincoln is constantly trying to accommodate during the Civil War. Bringing Democrats in is sometimes something that he does. Many of you have probably read Doris Kearns Goodwin's book, Team of Rivals. He likes to have some of that. And he's also having to constantly negotiate the political minefield of the Civil War. In fact, his second vice president, Andrew Johnson, is a Democrat. So he's not averse to doing that. And there's obviously, this is all politics, essentially. Now, Kirby Benedict is someone that he knew personally. In fact, he's an old friend of his. They used to ride, they were both attorneys in Illinois, and they would ride the circuit together back in the 1840s. And so he appoints Kirby Benedict to be a Chief Justice of New Mexico, despite the fact that it was very well known by almost everyone that Kirby Benedict was a falling down drunk most of the time. Even when he was on the bench, he was drunk. And there are numerous accounts of this. In fact, he ends up dying on the streets in 1868, consumed by his alcoholism. And despite all of these reports, not just the alcoholism, but some pretty strange behavior, despite all of these reports, Lincoln refused to remove Benedict from his position. In fact, he said, Benedict knows more about law drunk than anyone in New Mexico sober. So he stuck by his old buddy. Now, where it might have ended, where it had its limits, this idea of patronage. Miguel Otero had been the territorial representative in Congress and wanted the position of governor. Otero was married to a Southern belle and had actually supported and very strongly backed the Slave Code of 1859. And so even though he seemed like the logical person possibly, or a logical person to be territorial governor, Lincoln specifically avoided Otero. What Lincoln is trying to do in New Mexico is what he's trying to do in the West. So these examples I'm going to give you, I would not suggest these are particular or unique to New Mexico. Rather, New Mexico is part of the West, this vast area that Lincoln sees as a blank slate of sorts, a way to extract resources, a way to maybe build a new America. You know, it's a blank tabula rasa, basically. Right? And one of those first things that he signs into law is the Pacific Railway Act in July of 1862. This is the Transcontinental Railroad, which of course will be completed long after Lincoln is gone. And this particular idea, this Transcontinental Railroad, a railroad that would connect the Pacific and the Atlantic, is a long idea. It goes back actually to the 1830s. People were talking about this. And then in the 1840s and 50s, there was a very strong push to bring that route, the southern route, this is what it's called. It's one reason why the Gadsden Purchase happens. This area in southern New Mexico and Arizona that is purchased to accommodate the southern route of this Transcontinental Railroad. And it's one of those things that gets log jammed for years in Congress because of the debate over slavery. Everything gets tied into slavery and the debate over extending it into the West. And the Transcontinental Railroad is one of those things. And once that logjam is freed up with the secession of the southern states, well, in 1862, a very prolific year for Republicans in Congress, the act is passed. And of course, it takes many years before it comes to fruition. We've got a war to finish. Lincoln said the great enterprise of connecting the Atlantic with the Pacific states by railway and telegraph lines, that's important too, has been entered upon with a vigor that gives assurances of success, which translation means he likes it. So the railroad, I don't believe you can overstate how important the railroad is to the development of the West. It connects the West to civilization, at least in the minds of white Americans back east. The railroad is hugely important. It's the internet of the 19th century. I mean, there's no way to overstate how important the railroad is to New Mexico. And the Transcontinental Railroad, by the way, does end up going in the southern route. It's the second Transcontinental Railroad. It doesn't sound as good as the first, but we get no respect down here in the South. Completed in Deming, actually, in March of 1881. Another act that Lincoln signs into law is the Homestead Act. There's Ma and Pa on the homestead. There they are, loving life, clearly. Homestead Act is another one of these acts, not confined to just New Mexico, of course. In fact, the Homestead Act initially has very little impact on New Mexico. More the Midwest and the other areas that are a little bit more suited to farming. New Mexico at the time is very much not. Of course, you know the Homestead Act provides free plots, I believe 160 acres generally, for free if there's a small fee, and you have to live there for 5 years, do some improvements, and then it's yours. And literally, certainly hundreds of thousands of people, families in some cases, immigrants, and you know the story, take advantage of the Homestead Act over the next several decades. Not in New Mexico, though. In New Mexico, very little of that occurs until some changes are made and some expansion of the Homestead Act that occurs actually in 1909 that expands the amount of acreage that would qualify for a homestead. And there's some other things that I would argue are sort of a legacy or a lineage of Lincoln, and that is the progressive Republican platform of the late 1800s, early 1900s. We can see the shadow of Lincoln in the progressives, I would argue, of the turn of the century, particularly in the Reclamation Act that will create the dams and the irrigation networks and systems that we see in the West. Again, not just New Mexico, but Elephant Butte Dam down here in the South is one of the first projects completed under the Reclamation Act. So it's only when these sorts of things happen that farming begins to become very viable for many more people, and the expansion of the Homestead Act. So again, Lincoln signed something into law in 1862, and many years later, we see the impact of that particular act. Lincoln didn't create this legislation. He merely signs it into law, as he does the Morrill Land Act. This is the act that ends up creating numerous land grant colleges throughout the West. Again, New Mexico, it takes us a couple years before we see our land grant college created in Las Cruces in 1889. And 1890 is when it officially opens. We see this picture here. That's Old Main. If you ever get to the New Mexico State University campus and go to the Horseshoe, you will see the cornerstone of this building is the only thing that remains of Old Main. And it was actually burnt down in 1910. It's a different lecture. So all of these things, the Homestead Act, the Transcontinental Railroad, the Land Grant Act, all of these in some ways reflect the Republican Party platform. The specific way that you develop the West to create it is as it is what it is today. A very specific act that Lincoln does that very much impacts New Mexico quite literally is represented in this map. I showed you the map prior when Lincoln takes office, and this is the map when he leaves office, and what we all know and love today, obviously. There's our map of Arizona and Mexico, signed in 1863, largely created using these borders to accommodate both mining districts and also the railroad. It's why the Western states have these square shapes. It's one reason. And I like our side of that border anyway, so no offense to any Arizonans. Lincoln's name is all over New Mexico. And this is memorialization. This is the memorialization of Lincoln that happens not just in New Mexico, obviously throughout the country, not in the South. I don't think you'll find a Lincoln, Alabama. I could be wrong about that. But Lincoln is memorialized, obviously in the town of Lincoln in 1869. That's when it becomes Lincoln, the Lincoln County, the Lincoln Forest. All of these things are essentially memorializations of Abraham Lincoln, reflective of the fact that Republicans will dominate much of the West, and they will dominate politically in New Mexico throughout most of the 1800s into the early 1900s until you see a split in the Republican Party. That's a whole other lecture as well. And I'm not even going to link Lincoln with the Lincoln County Wars and Billy the Kid. I'm not even going to mention Billy the Kid. So there you go. I just did. Okay. I thought it would be interesting to point this out too, because this is, yes, I'm aware Mexico is not New Mexico, but Lincoln has a very interesting relationship with Benito Juarez. Juarez is the leader of Mexico during Lincoln's, in fact, he is, they very much mirror. Juarez comes into power right around when Lincoln does. Without getting too far into the weeds, during the Civil War, the French occupy Mexico, which they do until 1867, I believe. And there are actually monuments to Lincoln in Tijuana, in Mexico City, and Juarez itself. This is the one on the left. There is the one in Tijuana that was actually erected during the Reagan years, in the 1880s. So not in the 1870s, but you see that. So that might be its whole other thing. Lincoln actually supported Juarez during this French occupation very covertly. He didn't want to alienate the French, who had kind of had somewhat of a relationship with the South. And of course, he had opposed the war with Mexico that had resulted in the gain of the Southwest. So I just wanted to point out that kind of interesting link there as well. To sort of wrap up my talk before I hand off to Dr. Pitcaithley, here is a map showing not an official ever recognized, but this is the map showing what some wanted the border to be, and also the Confederate territory of Arizona. You see how the alignment here is of the border and how different New Mexico would be if this was our border today. Boy, I don't know. But of course, that is not what takes place. But this was proposed by some people for a long time, this idea to create an Arizona like this. After Lincoln is assassinated in the 1870, there are actually several attempts to rename New Mexico Lincoln. So we were almost called Lincoln. Doesn't get out of committee. But this is what the Confederate state of Arizona, short-lived as it is. And I'm not going to talk about the Civil War because Dr. Pitcaithley is going to do so far better than I ever could. But I can't resist it. So I don't mean to, if you're using this quote, Doc, use it again. Because I love this one. Not that I agree with the sentiment necessarily, but so As we'll find out, the Confederates invade New Mexico right around the time of First Bull Run, actually. So fighting begins out here right as it's beginning back east, unbeknownst to those here. And eventually the Confederates take Mesilla after a very short skirmish, and there's a whole story to that, obviously. And this is Colonel Baylor, very large man, and led the Confederate force into New Mexico, at least for a short time before Sibley takes over. And this quote, it's just amazing quote. And he writes to a friend in February of 1862. This is a month before the Confederates are basically forced out of New Mexico. So far, Mr. Lincoln is not making much headway in suppressing the rebellion. He has got himself thrashed at every fight from Manassas to Mesilla, and today we dare them to attack us at any point. So, of course, the Union takes him up on that, and they are soon hightailing it out of New Mexico. But I love that. He has got himself thrashed from every fight from Manassas to Mesilla. I love it. At least someone knows that the war took place out here in New Mexico. This is where I'm reaching a little bit, find a connection, but I think this is valid. The gentleman on the far left, the rather large man, is Delos B. Sackett. Eventually, he's a general by the time he's in this picture, but he is standing with the other command staff with Abraham Lincoln at the Battle of Antietam in September, I believe September 17th, 1862, the bloodiest day of combat ever in U.S. military history. But when he was a young officer, first of all, he served in the Mexican War. And after the war, he was stationed right here in Doña Ana, in the village of Doña Ana, with the 1st Dragoons. And one of his duties was to plot out the town of Las Cruces, near a site supposedly as I almost said fable, as the story goes, by a place where many crosses were erected for either marking the graves of travelers on the El Camino Real. And there are various versions of the story, but Sackett plays this role in plotting this town, using his old West Point skills as a surveyor. And I love this picture too. You notice the guy on the far right. I don't know if you know who that is, but if you guess that's Custer, that's Custer. There he is as a young officer. So this is a fascinating picture, and I love looking at it anyway. So there's a Lincoln link in New Mexico, and we can argue if that's valid or not. I say it is. I'm in charge of this talk, at least for another minute. John P. Slaw, here's another intro. These are footnote type connections. Slaw plays a pretty key role in the war in New Mexico and the Battle of Glorietta. Specifically, he defies the orders of his superior and engages the Confederates when he shouldn't have, but who's counting? He ends up, long story, ends up in DC. Lincoln appoints him as military governor of Alexandria, Virginia, which he serves throughout the war. And he will actually serve in Lincoln's funeral procession. Now, sometimes sometimes it is said Slaw was a pallbearer, and that's not actually, I don't believe that's correct. In our idea of the pallbearer is one of the people carrying the coffin, there are actually several dozen, if not hundreds of people that serve and are called pallbearers in this military procession. So his specific role obviously was as military governor of Alexandria. And he ends up, as you may know the story, possibly you do know the story, he ends up being shot and killed by a fellow Republican, William Reinerson, on the floor of the Capitol in 1867. Both of these guys maybe didn't have the sweetest personalities in the world. Those are a bit of a stretch, I acknowledge. I appreciate your interest. I will certainly, if anyone has questions at the end of our talk, I'd be certainly to give you an answer. And I'd like to turn this over now to Dr. Dwight Pitcaithley. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Chris. Does that work? Good. I learn something every time I hear Chris speak. So thank you for that. It's probably worth noting that William Reinerson, who shot the Chief Justice, was from Las Cruces, and his house still stands here. Chris is focused pretty much on New Mexico and the war. I want to go back a little bit before the war and talk about the role New Mexico played in the argument to secede. Aaron mentioned a book I published 3 years ago now, the U.S. Constitution and Secession. I started that research now about 15 years ago. And in the past 15 years, I've tried to look at, or I have looked at, all of the prominent official documents of secession in various places, and I'll talk more about that in a little bit. But as I went through this in preparing that book, I found regular references to New Mexico, obviously the New Mexico Territory. So I thought I would, and they startled me because I wasn't prepared for this. I'm a New Mexico native, but this was all new to me. And so I thought I would read, I think I've got 8 small quotes just to set the stage of what I found. And then I'll go back and sort of set a context for that. The quotes are all from elected officials, either from congressmen, from a delegate to the Washington Peace Convention, which I'll talk about in a minute, and to Virginia's Secession Convention. So here goes. Surely, and these are, I should say, these are all from gatherings over secession winter, that period from Lincoln's election in November of 1860 until the firing on Fort Sumter in early April of 1861. So here we go. Surely, no one will be so credulous as to suppose that this extended barren waste called New Mexico, where in 10 years they have only been able to introduce about 20 slaves, is the field in which this extraordinary constitutional amendment is expected to operate. Is it to be supposed that this union is to be sundered because slavery cannot obtain a constitutional license and protection in the wilderness of parched and arid volcanic surface? The disposition of the territory of the United States south of 3630 was and is the main subject of difficulty. The moment we exclude the idea of future acquisitions or filibustering, this New Mexico possession is the sole bone of contention, the only subject of difficulty among the people of the country. The question is whether New Mexico, with its peons, with its wild lands, with its half-breeds and Mexicans, its mixed population, shall be free or slaveholding territory. He says we can ask guarantees in the Constitution for the protection of slavery in the territories. By these resolutions, in all the territory north of the line designated, slavery is prohibited. All south of it, which in reference to our present territory, is nothing more than the territory of New Mexico, the most sterile and worthless of its extent upon the whole continent. Let me see. This territory is now the great battlefield on which the South and North meet in wicked, foolish, fratricidal strife, this territory being the New Mexico Territory. At least, if it be necessary, by new accommodations to end an apparent war of the present states on the subject of slavery, it ought least of all to be at the expense of the simple, distant, and strange people of New Mexico, torn by us from the Federation of Mexico against their will. 2 more. We are asked if we will suffer the Union to be destroyed on account of the territory of New Mexico. This last one caught my eye because it's the one from the Virginia Secession Convention, and it is spoken by former President John Tyler in March of 1861. In March of 1861, 7 states had seceded. Virginia had not, Tennessee had not, Arkansas had not yet seceded. And Tyler was talking about the great Southwest, the New Mexico Territory. How would we get there? And he says, of what advantage then, if Virginia doesn't secede, of what advantage then to us is the territory of Arizona, using the Confederate term that Chris mentioned, and the beautiful Mesilla Valley? How are we to get there? So right off the bat, I was quite taken by that John Tyler knew exactly where I lived here in the beautiful Mesilla Valley. I want to sort of stop now and back up and answer the question, or try to answer the question, how did New Mexico become center stage for the political drama that played out over secession winter? Chris, could you pull up that first map that you used that shows the pre-Civil War New Mexico territory? This is sort of political history, territorial history, may be familiar to many of you, but I don't think we can understand exactly how New Mexico became front and center without a short background. New Mexico was, of course, acquired by the United States from Mexico following the war with Mexico, 1844, 1846. And between 1846 and 1850, there was great discussion, excuse me, on would slavery be allowed into the New Mexico territory or not. You might recall that Mexico had abolished slavery early in the century. So the land that the United States acquired was, and the war is 1846, 1848. So we acquired the land in 1848 with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Was it to be slave or free? And there was a very robust discussion in Congress between 1848 and 1850 of how that would play out, yes or no. The result, of course, was the Compromise of 1850, which had a number of pieces. The one we're concerned about is the one that governed New Mexico and the creation of New Mexico territory and the Utah territory. This is a little different map. Originally, everything above New Mexico, that's labeled Colorado, Utah, and Nevada, was Utah territory. So there were two territories created in 1850. And Congress determined that instead of Congress determining whether slavery would go there, Congress said, well, let the people decide. Something called popular sovereignty or territorial sovereignty. Congress doesn't have to do it. Let's let the people take care of it. And so that was what was determined in 1850, and that worked very well for exactly 4 years. In 1854, Congress turned to the rest of the undeveloped or unorganized territory in the Louisiana, that was the northern end of the Louisiana Purchase, to the west and to the north of Missouri. Congress looked at a larger map that we're looking at now and was thinking, as Chris was mentioning, the Transcontinental Railroad, and thought that one of the lines would run from Chicago to California, and it would have to go directly through the northern end of the Louisiana Purchase that to date was unorganized. So this new act, headed by the chair of the Territorial Committee, Stephen Douglas, a name you remember, said, well, we need to organize this. Southern Democrats looked at this, or Southern politicians, they were all Democrats, and some Whigs, looked at this map and said, you know, by virtue of the Missouri Compromise that we all signed on to in 1830, slavery is prohibited north of 3630. The 3630 line was the southern border of Missouri, the border between Missouri and Arkansas. Just to give you a sense of where that is, the line you're looking at between New Mexico and Utah and Colorado and Nevada is the 37th parallel. So 3630 runs just below the line between New Mexico and Colorado. And they said, we're prohibited from introducing slavery there. And we think that law that was passed 34 years ago has reached its limits. And if you want us to vote in favor of organizing this territory, you need to give us a shot at introducing slavery there. And so after much discussion and much gnashing of teeth, Douglas and the Senate decided, and Congress entirely, decided to organize two territories, Kansas and Nebraska, in the remaining Louisiana Purchase. And they adopted the same principle there that they had adopted 4 years earlier for New Mexico and Utah, popular sovereignty. The people of of Kansas, the newly organized territory of Kansas and the newly organized territory of Nebraska would decide for themselves whether they wanted slavery and make that notion known then when they drafted a state constitution asking for admission to the United States. The Kansas-Nebraska Act had two responses. Bleeding Kansas is one, because the people would decide. Southerners rushed into the territory, Northerners rushed into the territory. They started shooting each other. It's where John Brown went as a force for anti-slavery forces and literally hacked 5 pro-Southerners to death with a broadsword. So it was a gory story, but it's when John Brown first made it on his name on the national stage by killing these 5 men with his sword. The other important response to the Kansas-Nebraska Act was the formation of the Republican Party. Whigs and Northern Democrats were appalled that the 34-year Missouri Compromise that prohibited slavery north of that line was overturned. And they created the Republican Party in 1854 with its primary plank of being opposition to the extension of slavery into the territories. They were not opposed to slavery in the states. They were opposed to the extension of it. There's a lot of talk these days, in fact, in some books that have come out, that try to make the argument that the Republican Party was an abolitionist party. It was not in 1860 and 61. It became an abolitionist party because of the war, but in 1860, it was only opposed to the extension of slavery, not the existence of slavery. In 1856, the first presidential candidate for the Republican Party was John C. Fremont, hero of the Mexican War. The Democratic Party candidate was James Buchanan, a Pennsylvanian with pro-slavery sentiments. He may have been our first gay president, but that's another story. Buchanan is also, he's one of my favorite presidents. He's our worst president, or one of the worst presidents we've ever had. And there are great stories talking about James Buchanan, who really set the stage in some respects for the Civil War. Fast forward 4 years to the election of 1860, and what is still riling politics in this country is slavery in the territories. It starts in 1850. Actually, it starts with the end of the Mexican War in 1848. By 1860, it's still going. And in fact, it has major implications for the parties in that election of 1860. Lincoln becomes the Republican candidate on a platform of no extension to slavery. John Bell was the candidate for the Constitutional Union Party, which in sort of a strange way said, well, we should all abide by the Constitution, when knowing it was, of course, differences of opinion on interpreting the Constitution that created the furor in the first place. He adopted sort of the Nancy Reagan position of, why can't we all just get along? He got the fewest votes in the 4-horse race. The issue of slavery in the territories split the Democratic Party in 1860, and they developed a northern party and a southern party. The Northern Democratic Party nominated, Stephen Douglas, who was still holding to his popular sovereignty argument. We developed the territories and let the people decide for themselves. For Southern Democrats, who nominated John Breckinridge, a Kentuckian who happened to be James Buchanan's vice president, enough time had passed that they believed slavery needed to be protected in the territories during the territorial period. At the end of the territorial period, when the population had grown sufficient so that the territory could apply for statehood, then they would write either a slave-oriented constitution or an abolitionist constitution. Lincoln wins, of course, in that 4-horse race, but with a strong minority position. 60% of voters voted against Lincoln. He was elected in the popular vote with about 39% of the popular vote. Nevertheless, the way the system worked, he became president. Chris, you can take down that map if you want. I think it's evident enough what New Mexico was during that period. It's critical in understanding this whole period to understand that although the Republican Party was clearly not an abolitionist party at that point, it was perceived by the South as an abolitionist party. Southern Democrats wasted no time in labeling Lincoln an abolitionist, labeling the Republican Party an abolitionist party, and believing that the North was filled with abolitionists of the John Brown stripe, he who had attacked Harper's Ferry in West Virginia in October of 1859. So as soon as he was elected, 7 states immediately started the process of seceding, knowing in their heart of hearts that Lincoln, as soon as he became president on March 4th, which was Inauguration Day back then, March 4th of 1861, he would start making inroads into the peculiar institution. There were in 1860, in the fall of 1860, 15 slave states and 18 non-slave states. So 7 states begin the process of seceding. The remainder of the states pause and enter into a very robust conversation of what the election of Lincoln means to the country, and more specifically, what it means for the future of slavery. It's this period that we call Secession Winter, from Lincoln's election till the firing on Fort Sumter. And those conversations were all formal, official, by elected officials in Congress. The second session of the 36th Congress met from December 3rd, about a month after Lincoln's election, December 3rd until March 4th, Inauguration Day of 1861. The discussion was held in state legislatures. It was held in state secession conventions, 11 state secession conventions. It was held in the Washington Peace Convention, which was a gathering called by Virginia of as many states as wanted to send delegates to Washington to talk about the issue and come up with a solution. The Washington Peace Convention met for 3 weeks in February trying to solve the problem. The totality of those conversations reaches over 8,000 pages. This is 8,000 published pages. Every state and Congress published their proceedings almost immediately, either in 1861 or 1862. Texas Secession Convention waited until 1912 to publish, but for the last 100 years, 8,000 pages of published material has been available to look at this. And throughout that conversation, not only are there all those references to New Mexico and slavery and the future of slavery in various and sundry ways, there were also 68 proposals to amend the United States Constitution to solve the problem raised by secession. Secessionists believe slavery was threatened. We need to preserve slavery. Acts of Congress aren't enough. We need to amend the Constitution. And as a result of that, 68 separate proposals were made to amend the Constitution. So we can quantify what the issues were that people were concerned about by codifying essentially the contents of those 68 constitutional amendments. And they break out, once you've read enough of this, in a very predictable manner. 68 amendments, 87% dealt with slavery in the territories, the topic we've been talking about, mentioning New Mexico, of course, drawing a 3630 line, prohibiting slavery above, preserving it below. 73% dealt with runaway slaves. 57% dealt with slavery in the District of Columbia. Of course, Southern congressmen and senators, when they came to the Capitol, would bring their slaves for the session. they didn't want Congress abolishing slavery in the District of Columbia. 52% dealt with the transit of slaves, as slave owners would do business in the North, mostly in Philadelphia or New York City. When they would do that, they would take their slaves with them. Some states, New York, originally allowed a grace period of 9 months. In other words, slave owners could bring their slaves into New York City as they were doing business for a period of 9 months. If they stayed 9 months and 1 day, the slave would be free. And so the slave owners made sure to stay for less than that and return. Slavery in New York in 1842 said that if we're a free state, we're a free state. We're not going to allow that anymore, and passed a law that said if Southerners come into the state with their slaves, that slave is free as soon as it steps into the state. And there was a major court case between Virginia and New York on that very subject that ran from about 1852 to 1860. Just sort of parenthetically, I should say on those constitutional amendments, there were about 5 or 6 other subjects that these constitutional amendments dealt with of lesser percentages, but the majority of them dealt with, the highest number of any of them dealt with slavery in the territories. Aaron mentioned this book I'm finishing on Tennessee and its secession documents. Tennessee produced 9 of those 68 amendments, and every one of them dealt with the issue of slavery in the territories. You might ask, as I certainly did, well, did any of these pass? And indeed, one did, the so-called Corwin Amendment, sometimes called the Adams Corwin Amendment, passed on March 4th, hours before Lincoln was inaugurated, and it simply said, Congress has no authority to interfere with or abolish slavery in the states. Made a very clear distinction between states and territories. Another example, if you need it, that the Republican Party in 1861 was not an abolitionist party. It was an anti-slavery party opposed to the extension of slavery, but did not have an issue with slavery in the states. Lincoln mentions this in his first inaugural address. He pauses about halfway or through so and says, I understand that a constitutional amendment has been passed this morning. He said, I haven't seen it, but he certainly knew of it and its contents. He said, I approve it and wouldn't mind it being made perpetual. Yet another example of Lincoln not being an abolitionist. The point of all that is that most of the solutions to the secession problem, as evidenced by these constitutional amendments, dealt with the territory of New Mexico and slavery in that territory. The only real territory in play was the territory south of 3630, and that was the New Mexico territory. Let me conclude this by talking about a couple of ironies in this whole idea of secession and the territories. The first is that in spite of the Republicans going on and on and on about opposing the extension of slavery into the territories, Congress has already settled the issue of slavery in the territories through the Compromise of 1850, through the Kansas-Nebraska Act. All the territory had been considered, and I should say the territory of Oregon, which shortly after the war was prohibited, slavery was prohibited in, I think it was 1848. I'm pretty sure that slavery was prohibited in the Oregon Territory using the exact same language that Congress had used in abolishing slavery or prohibiting slavery in the Northwest Territory, that land west of Pennsylvania, north of the Ohio River. So it was kind of a kerfuffle, more of about a symbolic argument than a practical argument. In addition, as Chris said earlier, New Mexico had already approved a very robust, detailed slave code in 1859. So while all this conversation was going on in these various venues, whether slavery should be allowed into New Mexico or not, slavery was already in New Mexico by virtue of the New Mexico legislature, and New Mexico legislature had the authority to do that through the Compromise of 1850, which allowed the people to decide for themselves. I should say that Miguel Otero, I think Chris mentioned this, is worth mentioning again. Miguel Otero, the delegate to Congress, was pretty much the guy behind the slave code. He had married, as Chris said, into a Southern family, was enamored of a Southern belle, and they were very active politically. He drank the Kool-Aid and totally misjudged the political winds that were blowing, thinking they were going to blow in a pro-slavery way. They went the other way, and in Chris, correct me here, in late 1860, reneged on the slave code and pulled it back. You can find it in the Slave Code of New Mexico. It runs about 12 pages. That's a little misleading because if you've looked at those acts passed by the legislature, the left-hand page is in English and the right-hand page is in Spanish. But nevertheless, it's a pretty detailed and was quoted in these debates that I've been looking at by people in Virginia, as far away as Virginia, saying, look at the slave code in New Mexico. It's the most comprehensive in the country. The other irony, and it's the one that we really can't escape when we're talking about secession, is that while Republicans took the White House, they took the executive branch in the election of 1860, Democrats won both houses of Congress. Both houses of Congress, not by large majorities, but for the next 2 years, Democrats controlled Congress. And of course, the Supreme Court was still very strongly controlled by Roger B. Taney, who had very pro-slavery proclivities. Two other ironies. One is that if we look at those constitutional amendments and what they were arguing for, the first one being about the territories and slavery in the territories, and the second one being about the return of fugitive slaves, secession solved neither one. By seceding, the South gave up all rights to the Western territories. By seceding, Southerners essentially brought the Canadian border down to the Mason-Dixon line. So escaped slaves that went into Pennsylvania, the negotiation was not state to state. It was country to country, making it all the more difficult. So with that point, let me pause. Aaron, we're going to move into a question and answer period now.
That's right. We'll open up the Q&A, and to make things easier, if you could just type your questions to me, I can kind of regulate that.
Somebody's got some questions, I can tell. Our presentations were very good, but they weren't that good. You've got questions somewhere.
So when did Lincoln become an abolitionist?
Shall I take that, Chris?
Go ahead.
Yeah, Lincoln gradually became an abolitionist, and he became an abolitionist because of the war. I think that's very clear. A historian named Bill Freeling has written a new book, maybe published in 2019, called Becoming Lincoln. And he talks about the evolution of Lincoln's thought along this idea. Remember, in March 4th of 1861, he was very comfortable with having slavery in the states that already had slavery. He was opposed to the extension of it. But during the course of the war, it dawned on him, and this was sort of a gradual occurrence, that if he attacked slavery, he would attack the Confederacy. And the more he attacked the Confederacy, the shorter the war would become. So Congress first passed a couple of confiscation acts, which set parameters for slaves. Slaves could be confiscated if the owner was engaged in opposition to the United States. As he thought more about that, and he thought more, I need a larger attack on slavery. It was in the summer of 1862. Remember, the war officially started in April of 61. By the summer of 62, he had convinced himself that he needed to be bolder in attacking slavery. He waited till the Battle of Antietam, and then he announced the Emancipation Proclamation, which says all slaves are free in states that are still in rebellion against the United States. Very carefully crafted, meaning it didn't affect slavery in those 4 slave states that remained in the Union, right? Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri. It's also interesting when you read the Emancipation Proclamation, he doesn't offer it as president. He offers it or pronounces it as commander-in-chief. It's a war measure. It's a military measure to end the war, which everybody considered at the end of the war, it would go away. It wasn't meant to abolish slavery. It was meant to win the war. And that's why Lincoln was so insistent a year or two later in getting the 13th Amendment passed, because the Emancipation Proclamation didn't end slavery. It was a way of winning the war and maintaining, of course, the loyalty of his birth state, Kentucky. Did that answer the question?
That's great. We have another one from Dean. Were there any significant Civil War battles fought on New Mexico soil?
Well, I say yes, but maybe a Civil War person would say, nah, they were small battles. I didn't, if I may, I didn't talk about the war in New Mexico. I don't want to scare you into saying I'm going to start talking about the war in New Mexico and pull up another PowerPoint. But yes, there were 2 major battles. Oh, I am trying to pull up a PowerPoint. I admit it. If I may, now you're regretting asking me the question. That's okay. Here we go. Boy, and I don't want to give you guys another long lecture, but in 1860, a group of white Southerners had gathered in Mesilla, residents of Mesilla, and declared the secession of New Mexico. And it wasn't acknowledged. Here are a couple of these guys here. They look like the guys that would do something like that, right? So Mesilla supposedly had already seceded in the Mesilla territory in the Mexico territory. The actual invasion of New Mexico happens in July of 1861, roughly around the same time as the first battle of Bull Run. And it's important in New Mexico in the Civil War to understand that this was a Texas force. And if you're a good New Mexican, you got a little bit of something against Texans, and you don't know why exactly, but back then they knew why. And it was partly because Texas tried to claim half of New Mexico as its own, in the border being the Pecos River. So that was actually the big debate and the big controversy of the 1850s. And so when this force comes up from Texas into New Mexico, most people in New Mexico, Hispanics, were ambivalent about which side they stood on the Civil War generally, but you've got a Texas invasion here. And so they're starting off on the wrong foot. But essentially, just as the first part of the war back east, the Confederates dominate. There's a very short skirmish in Mesilla. The next day, Union troops abandon nearby Fort Fillmore and book it to the Organ Mountains, fleeing what they think is a larger Confederate force. They're forced to surrender in a very shameful surrender. If you want, you can Google Dr. McKee and Isaac Lynn, and up will come Dr. McKee's scandalous, scathing report of Lynn's cowardice. Eventually, this becomes the Confederate territory of Arizona for about a month or two. There is a battle at Valverde, which is just south of, or right around San Antonio, New Mexico, or maybe around Socorro, somewhere in there. There's a really huge mesa that you can see from the highway. And Fort Craig is right at the base of that. There's a map of Fort Craig, or there's a map of New Mexico. Fort Craig is right in the middle, okay? And so there's a pretty pitched battle at Valverde. couple hundred people, couple hundred casualties. The Confederates essentially take the field. It's kind of a draw. The Union retreats to Fort Craig. They head north. They take Albuquerque. They take Santa Fe. And by the way, this is the Confederate flag at the time. So anyone that says the stars and bars flew over New Mexico, not during the Civil War, didn't. That flag flew over Albuquerque and Santa Fe for roughly a month. We have the Battle of Glorietta, which is sometimes called the Gettysburg of the West. It's nowhere near the Battle of Gettysburg in terms of casualties and scale. Not even close, but that's what it's sometimes called, and that it's a pivotal battle. It is the big battle of New Mexico. The Confederates essentially take the field, take the battle, narrowly winning it, but at this point, their supplies are low. They are in a foreign land. And as I mentioned, John Chivington prior, he leads this attack on the Confederate supply wagons, destroying their supplies, and try scrounging a living in New Mexico in the mid-1800s off the land. It's not going to happen. Union forces chase the Confederates out of New Mexico as they go. And that's my answer to your question.
A footnote, maybe?
Yes.
It's not unimportant, I think, that Glorietta Battlefield is now managed by the National Park Service as a part of Pecos National. I think it may be now a national park, or it's national monument. And the Battle of Macias is represented by a bronze plaque on the south side of Macia Plaza. So if you ever get down to Macia, you can see that. The landscape of Glorietta is a beautiful hike. The National Park Service has just put up a relatively new hiking path, so you can hike up onto the high side of it. So a significant. I give lectures to the National Park Service and delight when I'm at Gettysburg in referring to it as the Glorietta of the East, which causes some disconcern among the Rangers in Gettysburg.
Them's fighting words. One of the questions has about the New Mexico territory and its final borders. But what was the reasoning for the New Mexico territory to be remapped and its final borders with Arizona? And I think it's, to be honest, I don't know the specific answer if there's a specific reason. I think partly it might have been to accommodate the railroad. I mean, I understand that the Western states are essentially drawn up that way to accommodate the railroad in a way of scheduling, and I'm freewheeling this answer here. And so the borders are drawn up that way, and it might have been to thwart this idea of the north-south border that we see that I showed you before. It might have been like one of these kind of things, or whatever you want to say. But do you have an answer to that, Doc?
I don't.
Did mine sound somewhat close? I mean, that sounds. I have a master's degree, so.
Yeah. I think
that's it.
Actually, that the water courses. I mean, you wouldn't want to interrupt the Rio Grande.
Yeah.
You would want to keep it in one state.
Yeah.
That may have played into it. I really don't know.
Yeah. Good question.
Okay, so we have a question from Ellen. I don't understand what you said about secession bringing the Canadian border down to the Mason-Dixon line. Did I get that right? Could you explain?
I did that sort of fast, and I apologize for that. So if a slave escapes from, let's say, Kentucky to, or another example, let's say Virginia to Pennsylvania, then those negotiations to get the slave returned are between the state of Pennsylvania and the state of Virginia. When the South seceded, it became a separate country. Therefore, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Pennsylvania became not just other states, it became another country. And so you would have to negotiate country to country as opposed to state by state. I used that phrase, bringing the Canadian border down, because it was used historically. It was used at the time by Southerners saying, don't secede. If you secede, getting our runaway slaves back will be made far more difficult, because we will be in a separate country from the United States, and the complications thereof would be immense. So, that's what I meant by bringing the Canadian border down to the Mason-Dixon line. Does that help? Does that make sense?
I think so. We have one more question from Ian, hypothetical question. If the boundaries of the New Mexico Territory, Arizona, and Texas had been different, how would this have affected the Civil War in New Mexico?
Well, I think that, if I may, you know, as was pointed out, in terms of slavery, you know, under the Missouri Compromise, which I believe by the late 1840s had already essentially been ruled unconstitutional. And so there was the rise of the popular sovereignty, and so it wasn't necessarily still in effect, but it would have been consistent with the Mason-Dixon line. New Mexico, as Dr. Pitcaithley pointed out, New Mexico fits right under that line. And there under precedent, there wouldn't have been any reason why New Mexico would not be a slave state or a slave territory. And the same would go for, obviously, what is now Arizona. I mean, that would have been, now California was brought in as a free state. California becomes a state right away. New Mexico, it takes us 62 years. It takes us and Arizona longer than any other territory or state by far to become a state, which is a different lecture, I guess. But I don't think any of those things would have been necessarily different had the borders been other than the northern border, perhaps. I don't think that New Mexico was seen by the Confederacy as possibly a linchpin to an entire Southern empire. The silver mines of Colorado, the green chili of the Mesilla Valley, no, not that. But the Confederacy saw New Mexico as linking it to California. Very ambitious plan. It never gets off the ground, particularly, obviously. So I don't know if that answered the question, but I think not very much. I don't think border-wise.
Going back a little earlier, when Texas declared its independence, it claimed the eastern half of New Mexico. In other words, it claimed it to the Rio Grande, and that Rio Grande line went up into Colorado. And they claimed a strip. There's a very bizarre looking map that was the Republic of Texas that claimed land up well into Colorado, a thin strip down a part of southeastern Colorado. So when it became a state in 1845 without that western border being established. Was it the Nueces? Was it the Rio Grande? And the war then determined by the treaty to the Rio Grande for the country. But then when the part of the Compromise of 1850 came around, the present boundaries of Texas were established, meaning that Texas lost the large swath of what now is eastern New Mexico. And so Southerners used this to drum up a fever for secession, because that part of Texas had been stolen by anti-slavery forces. So there's a subplot going on there that irritated Texans, because they thought Congress had literally stolen not the Republican Party yet, but Northerners had stolen the eastern part of New Mexico. The 3630 line from the Missouri Compromise, small correction there, Chris, the Mason-Dixon line is the southern border of Pennsylvania with Maryland. But the 3630 line is the southern border of between Missouri and Arkansas, and then the 37th is New Mexico and Colorado. But that 3630 line had been established in 1820 with the Missouri Compromise, had become sacred. And that word is used in this documentation. It was assumed by everyone that slavery would not be allowed north of that line and would be continued below. So that's why a number of people believed, including Miguel Otero, that slavery should be established in New Mexico because it was well south, or most of it was well south of the 3630 line. It wasn't declared. Then the Kansas-Nebraska Act overturned it constitutionally. That is, or I should procedurally. Then a couple years later, I didn't talk about the Dred Scott case, 1857, but it was the 1857 Dred Scott case, Dred Scott being a slave who claimed his freedom. That was what deterred Judge Roger B. Taney again, determined the Missouri Compromise unconstitutional because he claimed that Congress could not abolish slavery in a territory. Only the people of the territory could once they go for statehood.
Mm-hmm.
It's complicated.
Yeah, boy, just a little. Well, and Lincoln too is constantly, you know, someone had asked, was he an abolitionist or when did he become one? And I would just think that I don't really believe he ever was a really true abolitionist. Because if you look at what abolitionists, I mean, and there's a lot of different types of beliefs among abolitionists for sure. I mean, Lincoln said even during the Civil War, he would essentially be okay with maintaining slavery if it meant keeping the Union together. That's what those people were fighting for. Those soldiers, most soldiers for the Union were not fighting to eliminate slavery at all. In fact, that would get you in a fist fight if you told them that's what they were doing. They were fighting to maintain the Union, and that's
Until
what
the Emancipation Proclamation.
For sure. And it's interesting though that what the Emancipation Proclamation does though is it essentially is acknowledging that slaves are property. Because you know, it's essentially well, anyway, no one asked a question about that.
But you raise a good point that I think needs to be clarified, and you're right on target. What is an abolitionist? And an abolitionist in the 1850s and early 1860s wanted the immediate abolition of slavery, something that was virtually impossible because slavery, because it's acknowledged, not protected, but acknowledged in the Constitution, needed a constitutional amendment to change it, just the way it happened with the 13th Amendment. The implication that most people draw from that is abolitionists believed in equal opportunity and equal civil rights for Black people, which was very much not the case. It was the case in some parts. There were some abolitionists, John Brown being one, who would eat and sleep in the houses of Black people, and Black people would sleep in his houses and eat at his table. He was very unique. Most abolitionists, and certainly free soil people who didn't want slavery going into the West, didn't want it going into the West because they didn't want to compete with Black people. They were as much racists, if you will, or white supremacists as Southerners. So just because one is an abolitionist doesn't mean that one is arguing for equal rights for Black people. And that's why the argument to get the 14th Amendment through was very tough and on a different plane from the 13th Amendment. Being opposed to slavery is one thing. Be in favor of constitutional rights and equal rights for Black people is quite something else.
Well, and in fact, Lincoln was a big supporter of the American Colonization Society, which sure supported freeing the slaves, but then colonizing them in Africa, be back to Africa. Never mind the fact these folks have been here for generations and whatnot. Yeah. There was one skirmish. There's a question of there are other battles further west. It was kind of more of a skirmish in Arizona, but since we're New Mexicans and we don't care about Arizona, we don't need to. But it was a exchange of gunfire. And but that's my opinion. Arizona historian would tell you it's probably something different.
Well, as we come to a close, do we have any more questions? Speak now or forever hold your peace. This lecture will be made available on the Albuquerque Museum's website. Thank you all so much for joining us today. Thank you, Christopher, and thank you, Dwight. This was excellent.
Thank you very much, everyone,
Thank
for,
you,
for
Aaron.
coming and paying attention. We appreciate it. Thank you. And we'll hang out as you guys depart. If you have any question, I'll hang out, and you guys are excused from class now. But if you have any questions, I'll hang out. They can answer for you.
No more questions. Oh, thank you. How many people attended, Aaron? Do you know? Do you have a count?
Yeah, I do. At one time, we had over 40 people.
Oh, good.
About 42 people. Well,
Thank you, Aaron, and thank the presenters. It was quite good.
Thank you, sir.
But I just did have, my wife kept saying, don't get into it. Don't get into it. And I'm going to get into it.
Go for it.
Of course. The situation with the Republic of Texas, 1845, coming in as from a republic and then coming in as a state. And the controversy about claiming to the middle of the Rio Grande, which is what Santa Anna agreed to so he could get back to Mexico. Why did the U.S. then pay $10 million to the Republic of Texas, or Texas, for what is New Mexico and part of Colorado?
Well, my understanding it is, and this is not my strong suit, but my understanding is that Texas got the 10 million because they lost the land in eastern New Mexico and Colorado. That it was to give them something as payment, essentially, for that land. How they came to the figure of $10 million, I have no idea.
Okay, well, I appreciate that because it was my great-great-great-grandfather that drafted the Texas Declaration of Independence from Mexico.
Oh, no kidding. Wow.
No kidding. No kidding. So I have a little bit different. And I'm from McKinney, Texas. Joe McKinney.
Okay.
But I'm in New Mexico now for some time. And you were with the National Park Service, right?
Yes.
I have taught at Albright Training Center.
Oh, no kidding.
No kidding.
All right.
Tom Lyons was a great friend, the Chaco group, and even into the Great Smokies and some of the people there. We put together the National Park Plan for search and rescue in the national parks. So I spent over a period of almost 6 weeks at Albright, off and on.
Lucky you.
Teaching and putting the together with the likes of Ron Kerbo from Carlsbad and Timothy Snedeker from Yosemite, and yeah, well, anyway. But,
for those of you who don't know, Albright Training Center is at the Grand Canyon on the South Rim, and it's been there since maybe the 1960s. The National Park Service operates two training centers, one there and one in Harper's Ferry. And I was lucky enough to go to both on a regular basis. But my first exposure was to Albright in really terribly built dormitories. I hope they've improved from when you were there. But they were thin walls and pretty horrible, actually. But
actually,
the location is great.
Actually, I only spent one night in the facilities, the little 2-bedroom apartments, a little kitchen and whatnot. Right. They put me up in the Alto Var, which was really nice.
Oh, really bad. Yeah.
Really tough. The other thing is, having been to Gettysburg and listening to the Rangers there, and actually having known a Ranger there, I really liked your comment about the Glorietta of the East, because they do refer to Apache Canyon, the Battle of Glorietta, as the Gettysburg of the West.
Right.
The Rangers do.
I thought fair was fair.
I love that.
Turn it around.
Thank you so much. It was great.
Thank you.
Thank you, Joe.
I would, I have a question, which is, I'm not particularly up on the Battle of Glorietta. But it was supposed to be one of the primary battles fought. Could you sort of outline what happened there? Or, you know, it was a close battle? Is that?
Yes, it was. I can't, if you seek specifics, I'm trying to think right now who I would recommend you read. That's a perfectly good question. I'm just drawing a blank on some good sources for you.
If I might interject,
Yeah.
Dr. Russell Skowronek has done a number of works on the Civil War in the lower Rio Grande Valley. And actually later this year in November, he'll be giving a talk all about that on.
Do you have some of his books in the library?
We do.
Chivington is very, very poor, and he's a crazy.
Not a good guy, perhaps.
No.
He was a very large man. He was 6'2" or something, and he was a reverend of sorts. So they called him the fighting preacher. And he very notoriously, before the raid on Sand Creek, extolled his men. I want you to kill every single Indian, every single one of them, man, woman, child. Nits make lice. This is a famous quote. And not really reprimanded for his actions at Sand Creek. So that's not a Civil War thing.
A footnote on Glorietta. As Chris said, the Confederates carried the day. There was a battle at a certain point of it, and the Colorado Volunteers had to retreat. But as that was happening, a group of the Colorado Volunteers had a local guide, and he said, "I know where the supply train is." And so they went sort of overland, sort of an end around, if you will, and found the supply train, which I think amounted to, Chris, over 100 wagons.
Yeah.
And descended on it, and I think shot the animals and burned the supplies.
That's correct.
And so the Confederates won the day, but ended up with absolutely no supplies, with a force of Colorado Volunteers between them and Fort Union, which is where they were headed. And so they were forced to retreat over a couple of months, I think, down the Rio Grande back to El Paso.
And a larger force from California had arrived as well. So there was nothing for the Confederacy, and they couldn't wait to get out of here. And you're right, it took several weeks, if not a month or two, for them to make their way down the Rio Grande Valley to Texas.
Yeah, if I may, asking about the battle and whatnot, and authors. John Taylor is kind of one of our current local, but I get a little bit more involved in that. My family's been around for a very, very long time. And actually I lost a relative at the supply train, that he was one of the 12 guards, Thomas McKinney. That we always thought that he died elsewhere, in reading John's work and Sibley's diary and other things. It's pulled together quite a bit. I've got quite a bit of information on it. One that I have not read is a new one that I just got called The Civil War in West Texas and New Mexico. And oh, I see it's signed even. And it is by the lost letters of Brigadier General Henry Hobson Sibley. So it's about his letters. It's John P. Wilson and Jerry Thompson, and it's out of the West Texas Western Press. Looking forward to reading it.
Is your relative buried in the mass grave in the Santa Fe National Cemetery?
That I really don't know. I don't think so, but I'm not sure. And it's in those that were lost. And I've heard many times even John Taylor saying, well, and they shot the mules. There was something like almost 3,000 mules. There is no evidence of, in any of the digs or anything, there is no evidence of that many mule bones. Right. And I know that this is New Mexico. And I know that those mules were taken to various farms and villages in New Mexico. There's no question about that in my mind. Yeah. No, I've been doing the research on, I'm a docent at the Albuquerque Museum also, and Casa San Ysidro. And I do Old Town walking tours for the museum. And I have been researching for some time the cannons that were buried in the plaza. And of course, there's not the Las Cruces connection, but there is Trevelyan T. Teal, who was Sibley's artillery officer, supervised the burying of them on the retreat. They had limbers, so you had an articulated wagon without a cannon is what it was. These were the 12-pound mountain howitzers. And they used those for the carriages in the retreat because they lost their wagons. And so they buried the 8 that the 12-pounders that they brought from San Antonio, Texas, through El Paso and then up. They took back the trophy cannons that they got from Fort Craig, all the way back. Teal came back here in 1889 at the invitation of a gentleman named Captain Jack. It sounds like I'm writing a story here, but nevertheless, and pointed out where the cannons were buried, which had been he said in a corral. And it was someone's chili garden at the time and refused to have his chili patch dug up. And they offered him $50. And he said no. And so they went to the courthouse, which was in Bernalillo. The Bernalillo County Courthouse was in Old Town at the time. And they petitioned a judge and filed a mineral rights claim. And the judge got really tickled about it and said, I've always heard there were guns or cannons buried in Old Town, and I'm awarding this. So they went back, and about a little over 3 feet down in an area about 5 feet by 5 feet, they found the 8 tubes. 4 of those were given to Colorado. 2 used to stand tube down at the entrance to the Capitol in Denver, and those have disappeared. 2 others went to a Army military post and were put on new carriages, and they're still at that post. Albuquerque has 2 of the tubes. We have one from the museum that has been refurbished, if you will, with all the accoutrements, the carriage and everything. That was done by donations from the Teal family. They were still in El Paso. The situation and we have one that we loaned to the State Museum. There's supposed to be 1 Teals in high school in El Paso. And then for some reason, we think there's a connection with Captain Jack and his descendants, and there might be one which has not surfaced even yet to this day in Socorro. So it's been kind of interesting. As Paul Harvey would say, the rest of the story was that we're old enough to know about Paul Harvey, that Trevelyan T. Teal was an attorney, criminal attorney in El Paso after the Civil War. And he maintained 4 households all at the same time, and possibly a 5th in Morris.
Wow.
And he was not Mormon.
He was a busy guy.
Well, two of the families actually got together, the descendants, and that's what the donation came from for doing we had a teal exhibit at the Albuquerque Museum, which was really quite good. If y'all ever come up this way, I'd love to sit down and talk to you over a glass of wine.
You're on.
I'm right by Old Town.
Ah,
In a little adobe house that's number 460 on the state registry. Okay.
Very nice.
The painting behind me is from the Albuquerque Museum show on your compadre there, Billy the Kid, and it depicts Garrett and two others riding into Fort Sumner to confront the kid, and the painter, the artist is Tom Ross. He also did a cover for the New Mexico magazine and participated in doing the exhibit on Billy the Kid at the museum. We purchased that from the show, and he said, if you can, again, the McKinneys have been around for a long time. He said, if you can find the painting of your relative that I've got in the show, I'll give you a discount on it. Well, it's John W. Pope is on the Big Roan. He's left-handed, and Tom was very good about researching. So the rifle is laid across the saddle horn, kind of left to right. The one on the mule is Kip McKinney, my relative, who was the deputy U.S. Marshal in Roswell under Garrett. So we have the painting. I've talked too much. But,
I'm always interested in where people are buried. And we know Billy the Kid is buried or allegedly buried up in, near Fort Sumter, I guess. Pat Garrett's down here in Las Cruces.
yeah,
All of his family, I think, except the daughter who wrote the state song.
right,
And he's buried in Roswell.
right. Well, there's some question about the kids.
Right.
Because of the flooding they had there, they don't know who is where. They exhumed a whole lot of bones and put them back together and put them in graves. So anyway, but kind of interesting. That New Mexico is a great place to live. That we've enjoyed it for over 50 years.
Well, as soon as we are able to have in-person programming, we would love to have both of you out to Casa, or at least to the Albuquerque Museum. But thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Aaron.
A fantastic.
Thank you for the invitation. It was great.
We appreciate
Absolutely.
it. Everyone take care. Stay safe.
You
Thank
too.
you.
Indeed.
Thank you,
Thank
one
you.
and all. Aaron, I get my second shot on the 25th.
All righty.
Thanks,
Have a good
Walt.
weekend.
Okay, y'all.
Thank
Pretty
you.
well.